Hi, I'm Leigh-Chantelle from Viva and today I'm here with Keith McHenry, who's one of the founders of Food Not Bombs. So tell me about Food Not Bombs, Keith.
Okay, well, Food Not Bombs started 31 years ago in Boston, Massachusetts, and basically I was a produce worker, and I was throwing away all this produce, and I felt that was really terrible because some of it wilts and stuff, and you know people won't want to buy it off the shelves. So I started taking it to these housing projects, and one of the projects that was down the street from my store and from where I lived was also across the street from a weapons lab where they were designing the guidance system of intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, these nice new bright glass buildings casting a shadow on these poor little thin people that were living in these dilapidated brick projects, and I thought, this is tragic. And that's kind of where the name Food Not Bombs came from. So then I started this idea too with my friends. One of them got arrested at a protest against nuclear power, and we started a bake sale and to raise money for his legal defense. But then we didn't really have a lot of support for that. People just didn't notice us on the street selling these cookies and brownies, and we were all vegetarian and vegan at the time. So although we didn't really think exactly about that being an issue, but you know, we had our, you know, that's what we ate, so that's what we made. And then we had a moving company called Smooth Move, and I moved this family that were activists, other protesters, and they had a poster that said, wouldn't it be a beautiful day if the schools had all the money they needed and the Air Force had to buy, hold a bake sale to buy a bomb?
Yeah, I love that.
And so we were like, oh, this is right on. So we bought some military uniforms from the Army Navy surplus store. We went down with our baked goods, with our sign. We told people we were trying to buy a bomber. They would laugh. And then they would go, oh, wow, okay, well, really, you don't seem like generals. And then we tell them about our friend and why we were trying to raise money. And it was much more fun, much more effective than just having a bake sale. That gave us the idea to do street theater with food.
Cool.
So then, in March of '81, there was a protest against the Bank of Boston, which the board members were the board members of the company building the nuclear power station. They were the board members of the company buying the station, the nuclear power station, and they were lending themselves all this money from the ratepayers and taxpayers of New England. And we thought, wow, that's a lot like the Great Depression. The bankers in the 20s were doing the same thing. So we decided to take some of the produce I was throwing away, make a bunch of soup, dress up like hobos, and stand out in front of the stockholders meeting at South Station and say, look at where your policies could lead to a Great Depression. And then,
how did that go over?
Well, the thing that was funny is in the middle of the night we got worried we would only be the 8 of us, and we'd have all this wonderful organic vegan soup and not enough people to eat it. So I went to the Pine Street Inn. Ronald Reagan had just become president, so it wasn't like there was lots of homeless yet, but it was just starting. And I gave a speech to the homeless guys, and they were so into it, oh, like a protest like the 60s, and they were really into it. And the next day 70 people showed up.
That's cool.
And it was so beautiful. The stockholders, some of them ate with us.
Oh, that's cool.
Business people ate with us, and the homeless guys ate with us. And it was so beautiful, we decided to do nothing but collect food and donate it to the hungry and do street theater with what was left over. And that started our path. And for 8 years in Boston, we did all this street theater, gave away free food. Sometimes we went down to New York City and Washington, D.C. to protest. We did a thing once called the Tofu Challenge to kind of protest the Pepsi Challenge, where we made tofu smoothies, fruit smoothies, and gave them away to people. And so we did that kind of stuff. It was not really, and we were friends with City Hall. We had a refrigerator at City Hall. But then in '88, I moved to San Francisco. Thought that would be a very liberal city. Many people think so. And I asked for a permit, and I never heard back from the government after pursuing where I was supposed to write for my permit. And on August 15th of '88, 45 riot police emerged from Golden Gate Park and arrested 9 of us. And that ended up being a funny blessing because they made a bunch more arrests. They made 100 arrests, but because of those arrests, people would write us and call us and say they wanted to get arrested feeding the hungry in their cities.
Yeah, cool.
So we made a brochure called 7 Steps to Starting a Food Not Bombs. We'd mail it to them, and sure enough, people started groups first in other American cities, then in Canada. We were arrested again, supporting the civil rights of the homeless the next summer.
Yeah.
There was 300 more arrests that summer, and that inspired another wave of interest. So then there was Vancouver, British Columbia, Toronto, all these places in Canada. And so each wave of arrests in San Francisco inspired new chapters. And eventually we had a couple of gatherings where we, in '92, was the 500th anniversary of Columbus discovering what was already here, the New World. And we supported a Native American protest in San Francisco. That was the official city for the 500th anniversary celebration. And we had our first gathering, and that's where we came up with the idea that our principles would be that the food would always be vegan, or what was sometimes the bread would be vegetarian. We got so much bread we weren't sure what it might be, but we would never have meat or dairy overtly, and that it would be free to anyone without restriction, rich or poor, drunk or sober. The other thing we decided was that we would not have any leaders or presidents, and each group would be autonomous and make decisions using a process called consensus, and that we'd be dedicated to nonviolent direct action and nonviolent social change.
There's some great ideas.
So that's those were our principles, and they've remained that way. We've actually had other world gatherings since, and we've come to consensus on those 3 main principles.
And why did you say vegan food?
We were already vegan at the time, although we called it vegetarian. Vegan was not a term we used until maybe the 90s.
Because vegetarian back then meant strict vegetarian vegan, didn't it?
Yeah, that's what we always thought of. Vegetarian was vegan. You can read our early recipes; they were all vegan, and we wrote about in our brochures and so on why we had no dairy or eggs or meat in anything or fish of any kind. That became like that. Distinctions changed after a while, and so we had like several reasons. The first was that we're trying to end world hunger, and so we had read Francis Moore Lepay's book Diet for a Small Planet, and that was an inspiration in part to why many of us were already vegan, was that you could feed many more people plant-based diets than meat-based diets, and if you're going to end hunger, you wanted to do that. We were for peace and non-violence, so how could we be violent to animals if we were calling for an end to war? It didn't make sense. And so we were obviously for nonviolence against all beings. And then also we had no money as young college students, and we knew that we could safely provide meals to everybody if it stayed vegan, because we didn't need to have all this refrigeration, steam tables, all the kinds of things that if bacteria were growing in meat and dairy could become seriously dangerous. And it very much, other than salmonella, there's a few things that could happen with uncooked vegetarian and vegan food, but it diminishes your risk of food safety dramatically. And our food is served within a couple of hours anyway, because we're feeding homeless people and hungry people, or you're at a protest and you're feeding people. So it doesn't stay off of the stove for very long. And that's made it possible for our food to have always been safe for all of these years, for 31 years, and no one's ever gotten sick by eating that food not bombs.
So a question I'm sure a lot of people want to know is, why are you getting arrested just for feeding homeless people? What's the issue with that? Well,
the problem for the governments in the United States, very rarely have we been bothered outside the U.S., but in the United States, the military contractors became very worried in '88. Bechtel Corporation, Chevron, Bank of America, Raytheon Missile Systems, they were concerned in part that the public would see us feeding all these people, and they would think, oh, food, not bombs. Why are we spending so much on the military? 50 cents of every tax dollar going to the military, while we have so many people living on the streets. Wouldn't real security mean that our people have food and housing? And they were very concerned that there would be pressure to either redirect the current tax dollars towards human needs, or that there be pressure to increase taxes on companies like Raytheon and Bank of America to handle this crisis of there being so many people on the streets. Another problem is that other politicians in tourist areas, and San Francisco was also a tourist area, was that tourists wouldn't come there and they would have to tax the businesses and the wealthy more to build shelters or to provide services so that the homeless would not be so visible to tourists coming to the town. And so they didn't want to feel that kind of pressure, so they felt it was cheaper to make laws against homeless people and laws against food not bombs, and so that's what they've done.
That's so sad, isn't it?
Yeah, so in Orlando, the economy has gotten very bad in the United States in the last since 2008 really, when the housing market crashed. And there's been about 3 million housing foreclosures per year in the U.S.
That's a lot.
And that's cost huge. There's almost one foreclosed, disputed house that's in court between banks for every homeless American, maybe more. And the thing that has happened is that rather than deal with it as a national crisis, cities feel like that they're being so horribly impacted by the large number of homeless people in their community, and they don't really have the legal ability to get the state or the federal government to do something about it. So their only thought is, let's make laws against homeless people in our community. So in Florida, all the southern states are getting a lot more homeless people because people get very cold in the winter in the north. They start migrating south. And now there's like a huge obvious crisis within Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. That whole region, the Sun Belt, has so many more homeless people that are visible than the north. And there's still a lot in the north, that they feel like they're under pressure to get rid of these people, to hide them, to try to do something to keep there from being pressured to provide funding to deal with this crisis. So their idea is to make laws against feeding the hungry. They've had sit-lie laws where it's against the law to sit down or lie down in your town outside. You're not allowed to stand near parking meters or automatic teller machines or pay stations and parking garages. You can't have signs in public. You can't take your hat off your head because that can mean that you're requesting money. So all these different laws are being passed throughout areas that are horribly impacted by large numbers of homeless.
I was in Portland last year, and they seem to be quite more easier to adapt to the homeless people. Is that true? Or?
Well, there used to be a time when there was pressure in Portland to get rid of the homeless, and then what ended up happening is that the population changed and it's become much more progressive over the years. And so the political pressure to hide the homeless has been reduced, and that's really helped. I lived in Portland in the 70s, and there was not so many homeless people, but it was a very conservative community at the time. I actually was arrested for the first time ever in Portland for basically being a hippie. And so that attitude has changed. Portland's a much more progressive city now. And Seattle has had its waves of anti-homeless laws, but then it's also had political backlash to that, and churches have allowed, for instance, this roving tent city. So every month people can camp at different parking lots of different churches. And so there's like the local people try to, Americans often realize that people living on the streets are their families and friends and co-workers.
Well, it could be them one day.
And it could be them, correct. So some areas are more sympathetic. It's harder to be homeless in Portland and Seattle because the rain is very constant. So they have that as a lot of people get discouraged about being homeless in those regions and move to Southern California eventually.
Yeah.
I know in San Francisco when I lived there, that's not a real rainy place, but it's kind of cold. And we had 150 people freeze to death in the streets of San Francisco every year.
Horrible.
So that kind of thing also happens in Portland, Seattle, where even though it's not like icy cold, that deep rain and kind of coldness of a damp climate is enough to cause hypothermia for people living outside, that you have roughly 100 to 200 people dying, freezing to death every year in all the major cities from San Francisco up to Seattle. So.
Wow, that's really big numbers. That's
Yeah,
really
isn't that
sad.
incredible? Yeah. And we were able in San Francisco to get the coroner's office to keep statistics of the number of people dying on the streets. And the coroner's office was worked with us, and they made sure that they had accurate information about everyone that died homeless, so that we would know the exact numbers. And a lot of cities wouldn't do that, but San Francisco made those accommodations.
And so, what would be your one wish for the world, Keith?
Well, I think that there is no real reason why everyone can't have, good nutrition and food. We're throwing away 40% of the food that's produced in the United States. Our whole agriculture system is really organized in such a horrible way, where we've got Monsanto and their crops being used to feed factory farming of animals, and the whole thing is just ridiculous. So the reality is that our soil could be healthy, which is a really fundamental issue in the United States because our soil has been destroyed. Even our produce and our vegan food is diminished in its nutrition because of these farming policies. So all of this actually is something that we know about, that we could solve if there wasn't greed and an effort to control food. So my wish is that food would be thought of as a basic human right, and that the nutrition of food and the quality of food should be respected, and that farmers should be respected, and that whole idea of agriculture being nurturing the earth and something that's providing nutrition to its people should become like a philosophy. And I know when I was younger, people looked down on farmers as being not so smart and ignorant and so on, and there was kind of this defaming farmers and a lack of respect, and so many smart people would not be farmers because they didn't want to be seen in that way, and that needs to change. So what's amazing is it's a real possibility that everyone have healthy vegan meals. That's not impossible.
No, it's quite simple, really, isn't it?
It's very simple, and so it's a matter of education, of our organizing, of our talking to the mainstream communities everywhere about this importance, and building an ideology that food is a basic human right. And we know that, for instance, the United Nations Human Rights Commission and the UN has that's labeled as one of the universal human rights, and it just needs to be something that's so popularly believed in that food would stop being a commodity, it would stop being a weapon, it would stop being used for manipulating populations, and instead be a guaranteed human right. And so I think that's something that's possible. I think right now we're in this interesting time too, where this could become a reality, because, for instance, the uprisings in the Middle East were around food. You see protests now even in China around the issue of food. Europe is having huge problems with their financial situation, and this is starting to become about food. And the United Nations and Oxfam have said that they believe food prices will double within 20 years. We're seeing the connection between genetically modified foods, the commodification of food, the climate crisis, and the fact that there's global insecurity around hunger. So that, as it turns out, is going to be the large political issue of the next couple of decades. And as a result, maybe there'll be enough education and pressure that we will see this reality that food will become a basic human right.
Definitely.
And that governments will not allow their people to go hungry.
And Food Not Bombs, the website's a great way to start.
Yeah.
Foodnotbombs.net.
Yeah, foodnotbombs.net has, I always have links on food politics that from articles that are coming out. I know Christian Parente has just recently written a very good article about the problem of politics of food and some kinds of things that I have. Oxfam reports, Food First reports, UN reports,
Great.
all this kind of information. And then also I have lots of information on projects that you can participate in. One of the ones that we're currently working on is Millions Against Monsanto with the Organic Consumer Association. And so those kinds of programs, we always do World Food Day actions, we do Meet Out, we do all these actions all the time to try to bring exposure to the issues of factory farming and exploitation of animals and horrible agricultural processes with a balance of solutions. We have Food Not Lawns. We teach you how to grow food. We have the 7 steps to how to start a Food Not Lawns chapter and start your own gardens. We have a section on seeds, seed sovereignty, which is a big important issue, and of course how to do Food Not Bombs, how to collect the food, how to prepare the meals. We have vegan recipes for 100 and vegan recipes for 6, and then there's also ways that you can donate to Food Not Bombs, or you can find out how to start your own Food Not Bombs chapter. And really starting your own chapter or participating in a local Food Not Bombs group is the main focus of the Food Not Bombs website.
And there's so many different chapters worldwide. I know where I come from in Brisbane, Australia, there's one. So yeah, they're everywhere. So make sure you check out the Food Not Bombs website for more information. And thank you so much, Keith,
Thank you so
having
much.
the interview. And see VivaLaVegan.net for more interviews with inspiring vegans.
Thanks.